I'm here with other Sinai and Synapses Fellows, Isaac, also Adam, and Sarah. We're going to talk for a little while about the Anthropocene and ways in which people are thinking about that today. So if we need a little bit of a jumping off point from there, when we're talking about the Anthropocene, we want to think about it as climate change, yes, but also some of the geological features about how it is that we mark this distinctive place of human being as a geological force in the history of the planet, right? So one of the things that I'm interested in, and maybe we'll talk about it or maybe we won't, is this place of thinking about not just the Anthropocene right now, but what it would mean for how we would want to talk about climate in 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 years, right? And what that looks like, or does it matter if we start thinking about our human action and climate change in much longer time scales?
So when you're talking about time scales, explain that to me. Focus me in on that, please.
So one way of thinking about this would be to think about the Holocene, right, which lasts around 10,000 years. Mm-hmm. So the Anthropocene then would be a new epoch, right, a place after the Holocene, right? So what does it mean if we start thinking about the next 10,000 years of human history rather than just the sort of next 100 years of carbon emissions? Does that help us think about or deal with the current environmental crises we face in any substantial ways?
Well, I mean, I know from the perspective of climate change that we would be going into an ice age had we not pumped greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. So in that context, we have already changed our future by past action that we can't take back. So I guess unless we create some sort of mechanism for pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere to reverse that trend and build up our ice again, that's the direction we are going. So in that context, I guess we've changed our future. So
yeah, so if we're kind of an indelible part of this, how do we start trying to think about it in maybe less scary terms and more in terms that would think about longevity or strategies for dealing with this interaction in new ways?
Well, as we were saying a few minutes ago, like I do find it sort of lowers my kind of fear temperature a little bit to sort of think about, however bad, we make things with climate change. It may get so bad that we eradicate ourselves as a species, and the Earth and life on Earth will sort of continue on, the Earth, the biosphere will sort of eventually sort of like cleanse itself and sort of balance. Just sort of thinking about that loosely. I don't know if that's actually strictly true, but it sounds good, and it sort of, subdues my fear a little bit. But if we're asking the question of like, how do we think about these things on the scale of 10,000 years? I do sort of have that immediate question of sort of like, well, are we picturing a 10,000 year future that has humans or doesn't? It's hard for me to get past that particular question.
Yeah. So a 10,000 year. I just
picked an arbitrary number, by the way. So
yeah,
if you want a different one, feel free. It just sounded good.
12 and a half.
Yeah.
Or 3 million.
Yeah.
Or because perhaps even if we aren't, perhaps we've actually tied ourselves to this planet in a way that the planet has become dependent on us in the sense that we're producing, or we have produced 62,000 tons of radioactive waste that needs to be climate controlled and maintained for millions of years.
That's sort of an interesting point.
So we're not getting rid of that stuff, and neither is the Earth. So if we're not there to maintain it, so that was goes back to a little bit about our question. Perhaps maybe we could go back to this issue of the Anthropocene and when it began, because we could say, if we say it began with leaving chunks of smelt out in the desert from refining metals, yeah, that leaves an indelible mark. Or agricultural waste, that leaves a mark. But I think the Earth can handle those. I'm not sure it can handle the nuclear waste that we've created.
Yeah, there's something really different about choosing, smelt 4,000 or 5,000 years ago and choosing, right, an entire layer of rock that shows evidence of this nuclear waste from the past 50 years or 60 years ago, right? And what that means in terms of this, I like that phrase that you use, right? Like that the Earth needs us in a way.
We may have made it so that without the maintenance of these facilities to house nuclear waste, which we're producing, I just looked it up. It's about 2,000 tons per power plant per year. That has to be maintained in perpetuity.
I mean, we could create AI to
maintain it.
For creation, for those beings that evolve after we're gone. And I mean, according to how evolution works, if a little gets out in a little time frame, in a small enough way, may not destroy everything, and some things may adapt. I mean, that's a really scary thing to think about. Thanks for that.
I need actually to revise my numbers. It's 2,300 ton for the industry per year. About 20 ton per plant.
Wow.
Okay,
20
so
tons
okay, that's
per
a little
plant.
bit less
20 ton per plant per year.
20 tons per plant per year.
Right. According to
Google.
And that has to be temperature maintained.
Yeah. And,
Okay.
So just throw it in the Arctic.
and then
That was a joke.
Which will blow.
Clarify, that's a joke.
So
that question of when have we actually made our mark on this planet? Perhaps the nuclear age is a good qualifies.
Right. So how do we start? Part of my interest in this, right, is I take some comfort in this idea that like the Earth will roll along with human beings or without it. I don't know if I should take comfort in that. Maybe it won't. It turns out, right? But I wonder about a lot of what we're describing here, right? When we talk about the planet needing us, or these sort of issues about how we have to regulate materials that we've produced now. It ties us to the environment in a way that's maybe a little different than traditionally how we think about this. I mean, it sounds to me, right, like we become sort of inextricably part of it, right? There's a relationship that we can't really get rid of or sever. It becomes really critical, but I think that's hard for people to think about.
Well, we're not different than nature.
Right, but this makes that sort of clear in a way that's, I feel like it's almost more visceral. So what do you think are the challenges? And this is actually like a question that I like ask like in my own research all the time, right? So it's a real question. I don't think I have a good answer. Like what are the challenges to thinking about our embeddedness in nature that way? Why does that seem like it's so hard for us to do? Because my experience has been people tend to be pretty bad at it, and we tend to sort of want to like put like nature's over there. It's all the pristine stuff that we leave alone, and then there's us over here, and we can do with it as we want. But there's a big divide there.
Even being an environmental ethicist, as an urban human, I'm I'm not immersed in nature the way, I mean, my environment is nature, but it's been folded and molded. It's concrete and high rises. It's pulling into a garage, pulling out of a garage, driving down a concrete highway, pulling into a parking structure, and walking down a sidewalk and going into a building. You know, operating on a desktop and then doing the same to get back to my home. So I go to a grocery store. I don't go out and harvest. I don't go berry picking. I don't go hunting. I'm not swimming in lakes and rivers. Sometimes I do, but very rarely. And when I go walking in nature, it's generally for a half an hour to 2 hours, a week, if I'm lucky. Even when I'm teaching about the subject, I'm in a building. We have a rock garden on campus that I can take a class to. It's not the same as being immersed in nature. It's not the same as even 100 years ago. I'd love to have a garden, but that's just so much work. So I made one and then it died. And I haven't done it again. So, my immersion in nature is my cat. It kind of despairs me, honestly, on a level that I don't normally talk about. Yeah.
I think it's such an interesting question, and your answer, which I think applies to all of us to varying degrees. But I sort of wonder if the divide, the chasm we've created between ourselves and nature by living in cities and being in buildings and all this stuff is just so sort of like an outward manifestation of something that was already there. To your question, Adam, was sort of like, why do we tend to view ourselves like distinct from nature and kind of having agency over versus just part of it? I also don't know the answer to that question, but I just kind of wonder about our kind of ego structure that somehow seems tied into that, or kind of our the experience I have of myself as like an individual, with consciousness and agency, somehow gives me this illusion of being that individual. I wonder if it's related to a question that came to my mind when you mentioned this idea of maybe it's not only a new epoch, but like a new eon.
Yeah.
My immediate question is sort of what what was the tipping point, or I don't know if the tipping point, but the kind of maybe the tipping agent, what at its root would be the root cause of something like that. Is it the fact that we have consciousness, or is it our ability to use tools, or something that sort of is related to this this mindset that we have of being separate, and also a way to kind of act out that separateness, to terrifying degrees, where we can create substances that are so lethal for ourselves and for the earth at scale. Just finding connections between these things.
And I wonder also about if we're overestimating the division between ourselves and nature, in that plants and animals have always changed the planet, right? Whether it's oxygenating the planet, or whether it's completely animals moving into an area that deforest it and turn it into a few thousand years later it's a desert. So we've changed our environment, but being part of nature, this is nature. And then beyond that, I absolutely agree with Sarah in the feeling of being so urban that we're completely divorced from our food production or other animals, that sort of thing. But that's not exactly true, because we have a microbiome that is absolutely essential to our being. And so on us and in us, we carry a complete environment that is completely natural and not us. When the vast majority of the DNA in my body isn't my own, this is we haven't really sanitized ourselves or separated ourselves from nature, as though we could, as though we were somehow not evolved from the rest of the animal world.
I mean, my hunch is that, like, the idea of the Anthropocene, right, in a certain sense, it's kind of like a symbol, right? Like, it's sort of meant to sort of foster that sense of connection in us, right? That we never really were a part of, like, we were never really apart from nature. But, you know, this becomes, you know, a way of sort of indicating that, right? Sort of trying to plant a flag in the ground and say, aha, it always was that way, and now we can show here's why, right? But I feel like, kind of like you said, right? Like, even like when I like go, like, you know, I don't live in a big city, right? But I can go out to the fields, right? And when I, like, you know, go, you know, a mile north of town and I'm walking through the sorghum and wheat fields, right? Like, that's not a natural environment in any way, shape, or form, right, for that prairie, right? I mean, it's also, like, highly modified. So part of I guess maybe my question then is, what are the things that we need, right, to help us feel like we're part of that environment? We sort of, I feel like we've had a lot of, maybe they'll edit this out later, right? I feel like we've had a lot of anxiety and despair today about, like, how bad things are, right? So part of my question then is, right, like, what are the things that we need to give people in order to help foster this sense of connection, to sort of make that bridge to hope out of these terrifying facts about 20 tons of nuclear material being produced by each plant a year?
I really like the example of the microbiome, you know, because it's sort of like, well, however removed from nature you feel, like, you know, you still have that. I mean, if you want to, you know, keep living and digesting and all that. But I don't think many of us think of that very readily. So, I mean, I can imagine some, like, really cool, like, animation or, like, VR sort of, like, showing, you know, aspects of, like, what the microbiome is and does.
Some people find it just very disturbing.
I can see that direction.
It's not a comforting thing.
Mm-hmm. Because they want a clean environment.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But we can't live in a clean environment. Right? We can't live alone. Literally.
Yeah.
You know. So your question though about how do we
start to engage people? How do we start making them a little more comfortable with, maybe, one, the idea that you're not living alone, right? I like that phrase a lot. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? But also then, like, how do you help, like, make that an asset, right? Like, if our sort of standard narrative is, like,
to accomplish what though?
Well,
like, what is the?
I'll put it this way, right? I've got a little bit of a horse in the race. I would kind of, I'm somewhat comforted by the Earth going on without us, but on the other hand, I'd kind of like, you know, humans or something evolved for humans to sort of still be around.
Sure. Agreed.
And I don't think that humans, you know, as ingenious and creative and diverse as we are, I don't think that 10,000 years from now, we're just going to, you know, throw in the towel and say, hey, we're, you know, there's no oxygen left. We've burned the planet up. I don't think we're not going to figure out how to throw some air conditioning in a building and pump something into it for us to stay alive. I mean, that's where I'm at with it. I think humans will figure that out. I don't know if that will do the best job at keeping everyone alive, and we don't need to go on with my feelings on that part of it. But I mean, y'all have seen the movies on who gets to go into the cave and who doesn't when the asteroid comes, right?
Yeah.
Apocalypse. Anyway, but so biodiversity though, like speaking of not being alone, if you're in a community, the strongest communities are the ones that have that are the most diverse, and they're the most resilient. So I think forming those connections and building the strongest community that you can, that's the ticket. So microbiome, I don't know, build one that's resistant to nuclear waste.
CRISPR. Right. We were talking about
Or you in the CRISPR.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's possible, though.
We can build it so we can eat that stuff.
So this is like this idea of like talking about biodiversity as a community. I think that's really interesting too, right? Like, because I don't think about my microbiome on like a daily basis, right? Like
we only just learned it was there.
Right, and moreover,
you might
like
have one in your brain as well now. Did you know that?
This is so cool, right?
Maybe.
But I wonder about like if we're thinking about like that biodiversity as a sort of community, right? For folks from religious traditions, right? There's this implication, right, that human beings have some sort of care or stewardship in creation as part of our responsibility. What does the way we think about that change if we think of ourselves as part of this community, right, of diverse sorts of creatures that we want to have around, not just for the next 100 or 200 or 300 years, but in some way that we are indelibly a part of for 10 or 20 or 25 or 30,000 years. Does thinking about those sorts of scales change the way we want to make decisions, right? We talked a little bit with Sarah this morning about political will, right? This thinking on a bigger time scale give us a different sort of political will. Or is it just overwhelming?